Stepmom abandoned my dad during his Canc battle, then his secret video exposed her cheating. Hi there, I'm a 24-year-old guy, and I wanted to share this recent experience of mine. A little about me first. I come from a fairly wealthy background since my dad works as a movie producer. We live in a small coastal country, so chances are you've probably never heard of him outside our region. My dad, let's call him Theo, met my mom when they were both my age, 24. They got married after my mom found out she was pregnant with me. Tragically, my mom passed away due to unexpected complications during childbirth, leaving my dad to raise me on his own. For nearly a decade, he managed as a single parent. Despite plenty of attention from beautiful women, my dad always chose to put me first before any of his personal relationships. During his earlier years in the industry, my dad made a significant fortune, which eventually led us to move to a city more centered around the film business when I turned 12. Adjusting to the new school was tough, though. I ended up being bullied by two boys in my grade, mostly over my clothes. My dad was the one who picked them out. Things escalated when they accidentally shoved me down 2 steps. The school called my dad about the incident, but he couldn't meet with the bullies or their parents because of his demanding work schedule. My dad always tried to be there for me, but his job made it difficult to be present as much as I needed. Eventually, he decided to send me to live with my grandparents until I could settle into a new environment. My grandparents were nothing short of angels. They cared for me as if I were their own child. My dad would visit during holidays and family events, but that was about it for the next 6 years. Naturally, this created a distance between us. When I was 15, I started noticing my grandparents whispering about something involving my dad. Curiosity got the better of me, and I confronted them, hoping it was news about him finally bringing me back to live with him. That's when they broke the news. My dad had eloped with a woman he'd met while working on one of his shows. Her name, let's call her Hazel, came up frequently in the conversation. My grandparents told me they'd married the day before and were planning to visit us soon. I wasn't thrilled. To me, it felt like my dad had chosen to start a new family after essentially leaving me behind. Still, I didn't have a say in the matter, so I sulked and waited for them to arrive. From the moment Hazel walked into my grandparents' home, I got an uneasy vibe. She seemed overly nice to me, but it felt fake, like she was just trying to make a good impression for my dad's sake. Honestly, I was relieved I didn't live with him anymore. As we talked more, I learned Hazel was divorced and had 2 kids of her own, who I might meet someday if I ever visited their house. My dad asked if I wanted to live with him now that I was old enough, but I turned him down. I couldn't get past the hurt and feeling of abandonment. So they left, and later, in conversations with my grandparents, I realized they also found Hazel's behavior suspicious. Life went on, and I stayed with my grandparents while finishing high school. I worked really hard and eventually got accepted into a top film school. My dream had always been to work behind the scenes, particularly in camera work. However, the best school was located in the same city as my dad and his new family, which gave me mixed feelings. I was content living with my grandparents, but I feared my dad might try to impose restrictions on me if I moved to his city. When he found out I got into the best college there, he was thrilled at the idea of me being close by again. I made it clear that if I came to the city, I didn't want him or his family constantly keeping tabs on me, and he agreed. Despite my reservations, my grandparents encouraged me to go, so I eventually decided to take the leap. Before starting school, my dad invited me to visit his home. At first, I refused, but after some persistence from both him and Hazel, I reluctantly agreed. When I arrived at their mansion, I couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The walls were lined with pictures of Hazel and her kids, with just a few of my dad scattered in between. Dad himself looked frail and pale, which worried me. He offered to pay for my tuition and invited me to stay with them for as long as I needed, but I declined. I didn't want his money out of pity, so I applied for a student loan instead and moved into the college dorms. As I was leaving that afternoon, I finally met Hazel's kids, who had just returned from their acting classes. That's when I got the shock of my life. They were the same boys who used to bully me back in school. Their names, Declan and Owen, immediately brought back those awful memories. I wanted to tell my dad, but I didn't really know him well enough anymore to predict his reaction. Instead, I called my grandparents and told them everything. They agreed it was best not to say anything, considering how long my dad and Hazel had been married. Bringing it up now could risk ruining what little relationship I had left with him. So, I kept quiet. I exchanged polite small talk with Declan and Owen and left as quickly as I could. From what I'd heard from my grandparents, these two weren't exactly saints even now. Apparently, Hazel's first husband, a wealthy businessman, had no intention of leaving his kids behind. But Hazel found a way to blame him for domestic violence, took the kids, and brought them into her new marriage with my dad. My dad, who didn't want more kids to begin with, eventually gave in to Hazel's wishes. From the time Owen and Declan were 15, they made it a point to remind my dad at every opportunity that he wasn't their real father. He provided them with everything he could, more than most kids could dream of, only to be insulted by them, often right in front of family members. To make matters worse, their behavior was part of why I'd been kept away from my dad for so long. Hazel never stepped in to smooth things over or help the family adjust to its new dynamics. She seemed entirely indifferent, and the tension weighed heavily on my dad. Even though my dad tried to act like everything was fine, over time, he started opening up to me about his strained relationship with Hazel. He would casually mention how she spent large sums of his money, supposedly to promote her kids' careers, though he doubted that was the real story. I kept my thoughts to myself and just let him vent. Deep down, though, I had a feeling their marriage wouldn't last much longer. While I was in college, I started visiting my dad and his family on weekends, but I never felt welcome there. Before long, I stopped going altogether. However, not long after starting school, I learned some devastating news. My dad had been diagnosed with terminal cancer in its final stage. He only had a few years left to live due to how aggressive it was. Seeing my dad in so much pain was hard enough, but watching him suffer emotionally in his marriage made it even worse. Despite everything he'd done for Owen and Declan, including helping Owen land a recurring role in a sitcom, they still refused to treat him like a father figure. It was heartbreaking to watch my dad try so hard to connect with them, only to be treated like an ATM. Hazel didn't seem to care about any of it, which made things even worse. By the time my dad was on his deathbed, Hazel had practically stopped visiting him at the hospital. Her absence spoke volumes. During his final days, my dad cried often, feeling abandoned by the family he'd tried so hard to build. Although we weren't particularly close, seeing him so broken and lonely left a mark on me. I tried talking to Hazel about being there for my dad, but her response was as cold as it gets. She said she'd rather focus on her future than wait around for someone to become her past. Her callousness was appalling. After that, I knew there was no redeeming her in my eyes. My dad passed away shortly after I finished my degree, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak. At his wake, Hazel showed up for barely 15 minutes, just long enough to make an appearance in front of industry bigwigs. Owen and Declan didn't bother showing up at all. That day, I made a firm decision: I wouldn't consider these people family anymore. I planned to move to another state to pursue my career, but those plans were interrupted when I got a call from my dad's lawyer. He asked me to come to the mansion immediately. When I arrived, Hazel and her kids were already there, looking impatient and on edge. The lawyer revealed my dad's will, which left 70% of his assets to me, including the mansion. He also allocated 20% of his wealth to my grandparents and 10%, along with a condo, to Hazel and her children. My dad had even left me a final message, apologizing for not being the father he'd wanted to be. I was overwhelmed with emotion, both from his words and the unexpected generosity. Hazel and her sons, on the other hand, were furious. Hazel shot me an angry glare before storming out of the mansion. Later, I asked the lawyer what to expect from her, and he reassured me that any action she might take would likely be illegal and wouldn't hold up in court. After that, I canceled my plans to move out of state. The mansion was mine now, and I intended to make it my home. I called Hazel and told her to collect her belongings and those of her kids, as this was no longer their home. Unsurprisingly, she was upset and accused me of being cruel, given what they were going through. I calmly reminded her of her own words about focusing on the future, which left her speechless. For a few days, I got a string of nasty texts from her, but honestly, I enjoyed seeing her get a taste of her own medicine. That weekend, I visited my grandparents to tell them everything that had happened. They weren't as shocked as I was. They'd suspected Hazel's motives for years, but they were glad to see her facing some consequences for how she treated my dad during his final days. After a good weekend with my grandparents, I returned to the mansion only to find the front door wide open. My heart sank. I immediately suspected a burglary. I called the cops and my dad's lawyer, as he was the only person I trusted enough to contact in that moment. When the cops searched the house, they found Hazel and her sons inside. They'd broken in and were acting as though the place still belonged to them. They even accused the lawyer and me of forging my dad's will, claiming there was no way Theo, their beloved husband and father, would leave them with so little. The cops were furious at their immature behavior and prepared to arrest them on the spot. However, my dad's lawyer suggested a different approach. He asked me to hold off on pressing charges, promising he had a better plan in mind. Despite my skepticism, I agreed to let him handle the situation. The lawyer spoke privately with the cops, who left shortly afterward. Then, he invited me, Hazel, and her kids to sit down and wait while he retrieved something he wanted to show us. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared being left alone with Hazel and her sons. They might not have laid a hand on me, but their glares and insults were sharp enough to cut. Still, Hazel wasn't stupid enough to risk getting arrested for assault, so we waited in tense silence while they hurled accusations at me, claiming I defrauded them. Eventually, the lawyer returned, carrying a box in his hands. What he revealed next wasn't something anyone could have seen coming. He started by explaining that my dad had suspected Hazel of cheating on him for some time. Her behavior had changed drastically after he got sick, and it made him suspicious. Wanting to protect my future interests, he'd taken action while he still could. The lawyer explained that my dad had added an amendment to his will. He agreed to increase Hazel and her kids' share by 30% taken from my share, but only if Hazel remained faithful to him until the end of his life. For this condition to be valid, Hazel had to agree to it in writing. When the lawyer presented this agreement to her, she had eagerly signed the consent form. I guess she thought there was no way any proof could ever be gathered against her. Her face lit up as she probably envisioned getting her hands on that additional 30%. But then the lawyer dropped the bombshell. He explained that the agreement also included a clause: if Hazel was found guilty of infidelity with solid evidence, she'd forfeit even the 10% that was initially promised to her and her children. The color drained from Hazel's face. Before she could say anything, the lawyer opened the box, pulled out a laptop, and began playing some footage. My dad, knowing something was off, had secretly installed a CCTV camera in the living room. The footage showed Hazel bringing another man into the house and engaging in intimate acts while my dad was either at work or in the hospital. As if the video wasn't enough, the lawyer handed me a stack of photos of Hazel with the men she'd been seeing behind my dad's back. It felt like something out of a soap opera, but I suppose my dad's career in entertainment had taught him a thing or two about dramatic reveals. Hazel, realizing she'd been outmaneuvered, began screaming about how unfair this was and how she should have been warned about the evidence. The lawyer calmly reminded her that the agreement, along with all its terms, had been thoroughly explained to her and recorded on the same CCTV camera. There was no way out. He then advised her to pack her things and vacate the condo as soon as possible. Declan helped his mother out of the house, visibly shaken by the mess they were in. Before leaving, the lawyer pulled me aside and told me to prepare for a potential court case and get the locks changed immediately to prevent another break-in. Taking his advice, I called a locksmith that same day and also reached out to my grandparents to let them know how chaotic things had become. Concerned for my safety, my grandparents decided to stay with me for a few days. Update 1. 2 days after the incident, Hazel did exactly what my dad's lawyer had predicted. She and her sons hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit against me, claiming she'd been deceived into signing the agreement. She also alleged that my dad had been coerced into writing the will in my favor. The accusations were wild, and I wasn't sure how she planned to prove any of it. My dad's lawyer reassured me that our case was solid, so I had little to worry about. Still, the drama wasn't over. Hazel then went to my grandparents, trying to manipulate them into supporting her case. She told them they'd received a smaller share of my dad's estate because I had schemed against them. My grandma almost believed her, but my grandpa stood firm, knowing better than to trust her lies. I eventually spoke with them directly, even offering to give them the mansion if they wanted it. That cleared up any doubts they had, and Hazel's plan to turn them against me fell apart. After that, Hazel called me in a fit of rage, threatening me over the phone. I immediately filed for a restraining order, which was granted without issue. Until now, no one outside of my family knew about the inheritance dispute. But Hazel, in her infinite wisdom, decided to air our dirty laundry publicly. She went to the film fraternity, spinning a sob story about how my dad had forced her to agree to an unfair will, and how I had schemed to leave her and her kids with nothing. Her story didn't go the way she'd hoped. My dad was well respected in the industry, and many people saw through her lies. Some even suggested she seek professional help. Others questioned why she was crying over money when she had a well-paying job. In the end, her attempts to gain sympathy backfired spectacularly. The production company Owen had been working with dropped him, citing the controversy as a liability they didn't want to deal with. The only downside to this mess was that local tabloids picked up the story. Reporters began hounding me and my grandparents for comments, turning a private legal matter into public gossip. It's been exhausting, but I'm trying to stay focused and let the courts handle the rest. My dad's lawyer advised me to stay as far away from all the noise as possible, but honestly, that's been a lot harder than it sounds. With every passing day, it feels like Hazel is finding new ways to pull me into her chaos. Update 2. Hey again. It's been a few days since I last updated, and I wish I could say things have settled down. But no, Hazel has found ways to make this even worse. I thought that after her credibility took a nosedive and Owen lost his job, she'd take a step back and regroup. Maybe even leave me alone for a while. Turns out, I underestimated her. Instead of retreating, she's gone into full attack mode. And this time, she's not just gunning for me, she's targeting anyone who could possibly stand by my side. Friends, family, even people I barely know. She's dragging them into this mess and trying to turn them against me. The first real blow came through my dad's lawyer. He received a letter from Hazel's legal team claiming I was emotionally unfit to manage the estate. Her argument? I was still grieving and couldn't handle the responsibilities that came with my dad's inheritance. It was insulting enough that she'd weaponize my grief, but then she took it further. She claimed I had a history of mental health issues that made me incapable of making rational decisions. The letter even named a handful of people, supposedly family friends, who'd expressed concerns about my ability to manage things. The kicker? Some of these people were folks I hadn't spoken to in years. How she managed to rope them into this, I'll never know. Maybe she made promises or manipulated them, but it was clear she was desperate to paint me as unstable. I immediately sat down with my dad's lawyer, and, as always, he reassured me. He called it a baseless, desperate move and reminded me that we had everything we needed to prove I was more than capable of handling the estate. Her claims wouldn't hold up in court. But still, it stung. Knowing she was willing to stoop so low just to claw her way back into this fight? It left me reeling. And she didn't stop there. Through mutual connections, I found out Hazel had been reaching out to my dad's former business partners. She was spinning tales, trying to convince them I was unfit to continue his legacy. She wanted them to think I was incapable of running anything my dad had built. Thankfully, most of them saw through her lies. My dad had built relationships on trust and integrity, and the people who knew him well weren't about to take Hazel's side. But that didn't stop her from trying. The final straw came yesterday when my car was vandalized. Someone had keyed deep scratches down the side and left a nasty note on my windshield. It said, "Karma's coming for you." Now, I can't prove it was Hazel, but come on, who else would go that far? The timing, the note, the sheer pettiness, it had her fingerprints all over it. I filed a police report, but without any evidence, there's not much they can do. Still, it shook me. This whole situation was no longer just about legal battles or manipulation. It had crossed the line into outright harassment. At this point, I don't even feel safe in my own life. I've been working with my lawyer to address all of this. We're pushing to bring the restraining order back to court, adding harassment and defamation into the mix. But honestly, I'm exhausted. Every time I think Hazel's hit rock bottom, she digs deeper and drags me down with her. My grandparents have been my lifeline through all of this. After I told them about the vandalism and Hazel's latest antics, my grandpa, who's always been the voice of reason, suggested something drastic. "Sell the mansion," he said. "Get out of here and start fresh." I'll admit, the idea is tempting. I've thought about packing up, leaving all this behind, and starting over somewhere far away, somewhere Hazel can't touch me. It sounds like freedom. But then I think about the mansion. My dad's home. The place where we laughed, argued, celebrated birthdays, and shared quiet mornings. Letting it go feels like letting go of him. And that's not a decision I can make lightly. Update 3. It's been a whirlwind since my last update, but things have finally reached a turning point. Hazel was officially taken to court, and let me tell you, it didn't end the way she'd hoped. After months of legal threats, manipulation, and outright lies, the court ruled in my favor. Hazel's claims that she'd been tricked into signing the will were thrown out. Her argument that my dad was coerced? Completely dismissed. The evidence was clear, and the judge didn't buy a word of her story. When the verdict was announced, I couldn't help but glance at Hazel. Her face was a mix of shock and disbelief, as though she genuinely thought her web of lies would hold up in court. It was almost surreal to see her defeated after all the chaos she'd caused. But the drama didn't end there. As we were leaving the courtroom, Hazel and her sons, Owen and Declan, got into a heated argument right there in the hallway. I didn't catch everything, but from what I could piece together, her sons were furious. They'd been banking on Hazel's schemes working out in their favor, assuming they'd walk away with a bigger share. Instead, they were left with nothing but the fallout of her lies. The betrayal was written all over their faces, and they didn't hold back in letting her know how they felt. Watching them turn on her was complicated. Part of me almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered everything she'd put me through, everything she'd tried to take from me, and any sympathy I had disappeared. For the first time in what feels like forever, I can finally breathe. The court has spoken, the truth is out, and Hazel's manipulations have come to an end. I don't know what comes next, but for now, I'm holding on to the peace I've fought so hard to reclaim. The courthouse hallway felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. After the ruling, there was shouting, loud, angry, and unmistakably messy. Owen stormed out first, his face a storm of frustration and disbelief. Hazel and Declan were left behind, their argument carrying through the corridors for anyone nearby to hear. A few minutes later, Declan followed his brother, his steps hurried and his face grim. From the way things looked, it was clear, the united front they'd once put on was crumbling. I thought that would be the end of it, but later that evening, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. It was Owen. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I even wanted to hear what he had to say. But curiosity got the better of me, so I answered. To my surprise, Owen's voice wasn't angry or defensive, it was apologetic. He admitted that he and Declan had been blind to their mother's manipulation for years. Hazel had twisted the narrative, convincing them my dad was the villain when, in reality, she was the one who had caused so much pain in the family. He even apologized for their part in the chaos, acknowledging that they had been wrong to side with her. Then he asked if we could meet up to talk, to try to make things right. I'll be honest, part of me wanted to hear him out. But the bigger part of me knew better. I'd been through too much, and the last thing I need is to get dragged back into their drama. So, I thanked him for the apology but made it clear I wasn't interested in rebuilding any kind of relationship. I told him I wished them well, but we needed to move forward separately. For my own peace of mind, I couldn't afford to let them back into my life. Update 4. Hi, everyone. This will be my final update. For those asking how things have been since the court ruling, here's the latest and thankfully, the last chapter of this saga. It's been a few months now, and life has finally started to calm down. The court ruling was a huge relief, not just legally but emotionally. Hazel's desperate attempts to manipulate, lie, and claw her way to a bigger share of my dad's estate failed miserably. In the end, she walked away with nothing but her own humiliation. After the case ended, I released a brief statement through my lawyer. I kept it simple. I stated that the will was legitimate, the court had upheld my dad's wishes, and Hazel's actions were unnecessary and deeply hurtful. I made it clear that I wouldn't be commenting further and was focused on moving forward. Hazel, on the other hand, didn't take the loss gracefully. She tried to spin her own story, playing the victim to anyone who'd listen. But her attempts to garner sympathy backfired. The industry my dad had helped her break into completely turned its back on her. No one wanted to work with someone who had dragged their family's private struggles into the public eye in such a vindictive way. Word spread quickly about her lies, her manipulations, and the damage she caused. The last I heard, Owen and Declan had cut ties with her completely. They moved out of the condo and haven't spoken to her since. As for them, they've been trying to find work, reaching out to people in the industry my dad once helped them navigate. But after all the drama, no one seems willing to take a chance on them. It's a sad outcome, but honestly, I can't bring myself to feel bad. They chose their side, and now they're living with the consequences. On a brighter note, my grandparents have been my strongest allies throughout all of this. Their support has been unwavering, and I owe them so much for being my rock. After everything was settled, I offered them the mansion as a gift. At first, they were hesitant. They didn't want to take something so significant from me. But I insisted. That house held so many memories of my dad, and I knew he would have loved for them to have it. Eventually, they agreed, and seeing their joy brought me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. They've already started talking about renovations, updating parts of the home while keeping its heart intact. It's their space now, and it feels right. Knowing they're in a place my dad loved so much makes me feel like a small part of him is still here with us. As for me, I'm closing this chapter of my life for good. A major career opportunity came up overseas, and I've decided to take it. It's the fresh start I've been needing, a chance to step away from the toxicity, focus on my work, and build something new for myself. Before I leave, I'm spending as much time as I can with my grandparents. I want to make sure they're comfortable and settled before I go. They've done so much for me, and I want to leave knowing they're happy and secure in their new home. Looking back, this whole ordeal was one of the most challenging things I've ever faced. But it taught me a lot about resilience, about standing up for myself, and about the kind of person I want to be moving forward. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe again. The chaos is over, and I'm ready to start a new chapter. Thank you to everyone who's been following along and offering your support. It's meant more than I can put into words. Here's to new beginnings.